Putin has been in power for nearly 25 years, setting a record for the longest rule in Russia in the last century. Even the most well-known Soviet leaders held power for significantly shorter periods. During this time, Russia has developed a strong authoritarian system, and its gradual reinforcement has led to the country becoming what can now be clearly defined as a dictatorship. Today, we will discuss how Putin consolidated his power, the steps he took to become a dictator, and why no one was able to stop him. To begin, it is important to discuss how Putin came to power, as this plays a crucial role in understanding later events. Putin's rise to power was not a natural political phenomenon, as is typical in public politics. Instead, he was brought to the presidency by his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, and his inner circle, who were already searching for a successor. At that time, Yeltsin was in poor health and no longer fit to serve as president, and the Russian constitution prohibited more than 2 consecutive presidential terms. In fact, discussions about finding Yeltsin's successor began almost immediately after the 1996 election. The oligarchs feared that an unfriendly candidate might replace Yeltsin, potentially threatening their power and wealth. To maintain control, they decided to put forward their own candidate. The selection process was quite intense, and by 1998, Yeltsin was rapidly replacing prime ministers. Eventually, Putin was appointed as prime minister and positioned as the ideal figure for further promotion to the presidency. Yeltsin's inner circle agreed that Putin was the right candidate, someone who could gain public support while being seen as lacking personal political ambitions, making him easy to control. At the end of 1999, Yeltsin resigned, and Putin became acting president, quickly gaining popularity. His rise in approval had already started during his time as prime minister, particularly in the context of the renewed war in Chechnya. Putin took a tough and decisive stance, and the apartment bombings in Russia further boosted his ratings. Against the backdrop of a frail Yeltsin, the younger and more energetic Putin appeared as a strong alternative. Naturally, he was also heavily supported by the same oligarchs and their media empires, which worked to shape him into a national leader within just 6 months. Thus, in March 2000, Putin won the presidential election with 53% of the vote. As we can see, even at the moment of Putin's rise to power, Russia's political system was already far from democratic. Under Yeltsin, many democratic institutions had been dismantled, and the country was effectively governed by a small group of influential elitist system that could already be classified as an oligarchy. However, despite this, Russia still retained a relatively high level of freedom at the time. Putin saw this as a problem and was determined to change it. Many believe that Putin's early years in power were relatively liberal. However, from his very first year in office, he actively worked to consolidate control, and with each passing year, Russia's freedoms eroded further. Almost immediately after assuming power, Putin launched a crackdown on independent media. Foreign terrorism was also used by Putin as a tool for centralizing power and strengthening laws. The powers of the intelligence services were significantly expanded, while on the ground, human rights violations and repression against local populations were taking place. The authorities cracked down on any resistance, especially when it came to those who opposed Putin's rule. In 2004, after his re-election, Putin dismantled federalism under the pretext of fighting terrorism, abolishing the direct election of governors. Instead, the Kremlin began appointing them directly. Direct elections were reinstated only in 2012, and even then, it was purely symbolic. Without approval from the Kremlin, no one could be elected. Russia effectively became a unitary state with centralized power in the Kremlin. Another significant part of this story is the battle against the oligarchs, whom the Kremlin either imprisoned or brought to heel. As mentioned earlier, oligarchs played a central role in Russia's governance during Yeltsin's era, and, in fact, were pivotal in bringing Putin to power. However, as Putin's control grew stronger, the oligarchs, who once controlled the country, were gradually neutralized by the state. A particularly notable case was that of Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Yukos. In 2003, Yukos was the largest oil company in Russia, and Khodorkovsky was one of the wealthiest oligarchs. In the same year, Khodorkovsky was charged with fraud and tax evasion. By 2005, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison, and his sentence was later extended due to additional charges. By 2013, Khodorkovsky was pardoned and left Russia. Some believe that this case was politically motivated, which was indeed the case. However, the oligarchs themselves largely did not support him and were seen negatively by the public. Many even saw this as a positive signal of Putin's strength. The case of Khodorkovsky became a defining moment in the dismantling of Russia's oligarchic system. The creation of the United Russia Party and widespread electoral fraud took place during Putin's first 2 terms in office. The party was established as a platform to support Putin's power and gradually monopolized authority through various legal and illegal methods. Administrative resources were used, the electoral system was manipulated, and election falsifications took place. In 2007, the party gained a monopoly in the parliament, securing 64% of the vote. This gave the party exclusive rights to pass any laws, and considering Putin's presidency, Russia effectively transitioned into an outright authoritarian regime. In 2008, the well-known power shift occurred, with Putin stepping aside to allow Medvedev to become president. This gave the illusion of a democratic transition. But as we now know, this perception was misleading. Medvedev's candidacy was a strategic move, as Putin, under the constitution, could not run for a 3rd consecutive term. The decision was made to elevate a loyal puppet candidate under full control of Putin. During Medvedev's presidency, there were some notable changes, including the extension of the presidential term from 4 to 6 years, and increased pressure on opposition parties. However, the most significant events during this period were the mass protests in 2011 and 2012, sparked by widespread election fraud. These protests were brutally suppressed. The government formally made some concessions, but the system remained unchanged. Elections in Russia continued to be largely meaningless, with courts bending to the will of convenient candidates. Genuine opposition was effectively excluded from elections. Moreover, in 2012, Putin returned to the presidency, and all hopes for liberalization in Russia were dashed. This return was made possible due to a legal loophole concerning presidential terms. The law had been written in a way that allowed for consecutive terms, so Putin's return to power was considered his first term under the new law. His next term was marked by the fight against protest movements. The experiences of Arab countries and Ukraine were keenly observed by Putin, and all subsequent actions were aimed at preventing what became known as the Maidan, a term the Russian authorities used to label any protest movements. In 2013, the persecution of opposition leader Navalny began, and he was given a suspended sentence. His brother was imprisoned. There was also greater control over the internet, with Roskomnadzor, the Russian internet regulator, becoming more active in blocking undesirable websites. The media space was virtually monopolized by Putin, with most outlets being brought under state control. In 2015, the Yarovaya law was introduced, allowing the government to effectively monitor internet usage. Any protests were violently suppressed. Putin's ratings were significantly boosted by the annexation of Crimea, which raised his popularity to unprecedented heights. Public support surged even among his critics, and the problems of his governance faded into the background. This situation persisted until the 2018 elections. Putin's next term essentially marked the transition of Russia from strict authoritarian rule to outright dictatorship. By this time, the scope of freedoms had already been severely restricted, but his government decided to completely eliminate any remaining opposition and actively fight against non-systemic opposition. By that time, the systemic opposition had already been neutralized. There are several key events in this context. The first is the change to the constitution, which allowed Putin to remain in power for 2 additional terms, potentially ruling until 2036. By that time, Putin would be 84 years old. This made it clear that there would be no more power shifts, no successors, and Putin had decided to remain at the helm until the end of his life. The second event was the complete ban on street protests. The excuse for this was the COVID-19 pandemic. But even after the pandemic ended, the restrictions continued. Any protests or attempts at mobilization have been completely blocked since 2020. The third major event was the suppression of any form of opposition, including the poisoning and imprisonment of Alexei Navalny. The story of Navalny's poisoning, his return to Russia, subsequent imprisonment, and eventual death in custody drew the attention of the entire world. And the story was even adapted into a film that won an Academy Award. This incident demonstrated how ruthlessly Putin was willing to deal with his enemies and eliminate them. For any opposition, there were two options: either leave Russia or die in prison. The beginning of the war in Ukraine led to the imposition of full military censorship within Russia. The so-called fake news law was introduced on the 4th of March, 2022, allowing the authorities to imprison anyone for spreading what they considered false information. As a result, dissenters were either imprisoned or forced to flee the country. In 2024, Putin was re-elected, further cementing his position and destroying any remaining opposition, ultimately establishing a one-man dictatorship in Russia. As we can see, the key steps toward this were taken early in his rule, but they were not noticed by the masses at the time. Over time, the authorities strengthened their position, and ultimately, this led to the consolidation of absolute power.